Welcome, everyone, to Free Speech in a Globalized World. My name is Michael Doyle, and I'm the moderator of this panel discussion, inspired by a new book by President Bollinger. I'm holding it up right here. It's available in local bookstores. It's Uninhibited, Robust, and Wide Open, a free press for a new century. This afternoon, we focus on the global aspect of free speech, one but not the only theme of his new book. While analyzing the remarkable establishment of national free press and free speech in 20th century America, Lee sounds an alarm concerning global freedom of information in the 21st century and warns, and I quote, "The press has displayed an alarming incapacity to fulfill the public trust of keeping America informed about the state of the world." This evening, we explore the importance of global free speech for big concerns, protecting human dignity, finding truth, sustaining democratic governance. What, on the one hand, does global free speech contribute to them? Should these concerns, in some circumstances, limit speech? Each panelist, rather than reviewing President Bollinger's book, will raise his own set of concerns regarding free speech. But collectively, I think we will be touching upon a number of questions that connect the wider issue of whether in an interdependent world, peoples can succeed in being democracies knowing only their own countries. First, right to that governance question. The connection between free speech and good government has long been seen as essential. Thomas Jefferson famously and controversially remarked in a letter to Edward Carrington in 1787 that a free speech is essential, not a luxury. And I quote, "The bases of our government being the opinion of the people, the very first object should be to keep that right. And were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter." So can speech be free in one country and restricted in others and still play the vital role of ensuring the marketplace of ideas that effective democratic governance at home seems to require? And internationally, can legitimate and effective global public policy be made when publics are poorly informed or manipulated by governments or by powerful corporate or institutional or religious interests? A second theme, and specifically, what are the major challenges today to free speech in our ever more connected world? Are they governmental, such as autocratic oppression in states, such as Iran? Or was the U.S. war in terror a similar kind of a challenge to effective freedom of information? Or democratic majority tyranny? Or are they instead societal, religious, corporate, or even fiscal? Is there a viable business model for the modern press today that will assure quality information and not just any information? And third, practically, what are the best or at least better responses that can be taken to protect or foster global free speech? Is the U.S. model, for example, generalizable? This panel, I'm happy to say, is co-sponsored by the Heyman Center, the Committee for Global Thought, the Center for Global Governance at Columbia Law School, and University Programs and Events. We thank them all. Our four panelists, I will briefly introduce. One of them will take a short introduction, given the fact that this is his office building. I'm very pleased that Lee Bollinger, the 19th president of Columbia University, a longtime advocate of diversity within universities and a leading scholar of the First Amendment, is speaking. University presidents often write a book or two before they become president and then write a few more after they retire from the presidency. It is a rare and praiseworthy event to write one while you are president, so congratulations, Lee. I'm also very pleased to welcome David Ignatius, who is the associate editor and the columnist of the Washington Post. He has enjoyed a distinguished and award-winning career at the Wall Street Journal, the International Herald Tribune, and of course the Post. And in the meantime, in his spare time, found time to write 6 novels. I'm also very pleased to welcome Salman Rushdie, eminent author of Midnight's Children, which won the Best of the Booker Prize Awards. Following the publication of Satanic Verses in 1989, the Orthodox religious leadership of Iran issued a death threat, a fatwa against him, accusing him of blasphemy. Fortunately, he was able to continue to write striking novels, including most recently The Enchantress of Florence, as well as essays and literary criticism. He's an honorary professor in the humanities at MIT and a member of the board of American Pen. Michael Schudson, professor at the Journalism School, joined Columbia in 2009, following a distinguished career in sociology at Chicago and the University of California, San Diego. He's the author of 6 books on news media, advertising, Watergate, popular culture. He has received numerous awards, including the Guggenheim and the MacArthur Prize, and most recently he is the author of Why America Needs an Unlovable Press. Each of the speakers will have about 10 to 15 minutes. The panel may then fan any sparks that they produce, and I may ask them additional questions before I open the panelists to your questions, and we will conclude promptly at 7:45. Lee, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Michael. And thanks to all of you for coming to Columbia and being at Columbia, Michael. And these are people I admire tremendously. Let me just try to give a very quick overview of what I've tried to do in this book. It's been a pleasure to write and to work on, and it feels as if it sort of lays out in front of me a set of very, very important issues to pursue, and nothing could be more exciting to somebody who's a scholar. I often sometimes say that one of the reasons for being a university president is because the bar for achievement is set so low. All you have to do is sort of walk and talk and chew gum, and you're successful. If you write a book, it's really terrific. But people here write books all the time, which I admire. I sort of start from the realization that we are moving into what I call a global public forum, and that's a high-sounding name for something that's really very practical and very serious. And that is the need for information and knowledge and ideas about issues that are distinctively global in nature. And of course we know the great ones that we talk about all the time: climate change and extreme poverty and issues of security and economic regulation and many, many more. And we are now facing, as a world community, a number of issues that require us to have information and ideas and knowledge to be able to address them. So that's sort of the key fact of life. I think the second thing that's really important about a global public forum concept is that we're now in a world where censorship anywhere can mean censorship everywhere. That's the way I try to put it. So the world has very different views about the scope of free speech. Turkey has a law that makes criminal insulting Turkishness. We know that China has very strong restrictions on speech in order to preserve public harmony and order in the society. We know that Germany forbids speech by neo-Nazis or neo-Nazi speech. It also forbids people to identify someone who has been convicted of an earlier crime and served their penalty for that. We know that Britain makes it very easy for somebody who has been defamed to bring a lawsuit and to have a judicial determination that that is false and defamatory and to recover damages. We also know that if you publish something now by putting it on the internet in one country, say this country, you then are at risk of being held to have published it in other places around the world and therefore to be subject to their restrictions on speech. That means that as we sit down to write things, whatever it is, books or articles or opinions, we are going to have in our minds, will this lead to some kind of legal action against me in another country? And you may not be so concerned about that in one sense, but at some point you may want to travel to that country. Or at some point the people who have gotten the judgment against you may come to this country in order to enforce it. It is a very serious matter. So there are very different perceptions and conceptions of what freedom of the press and free speech mean around the world. And at the moment when we need more and more discussion, we are at risk of having those very different conceptions play out in the classic form of censorship. The second big point is that all of this comes at a moment when things are actually seemingly getting worse. Now, we're not only concerned about censorship, we're also concerned about the quality of ideas that are circulating around the globe about global issues and about anything that we care about. So we care about both the restrictions and the quality. And one of the things that's happening is that there is a rise in censorship. I think one can see it in a number of countries around the world. Won't go into that here, but I think we sense that. I think that's an inevitable consequence of the greater and greater integration, because countries, societies are going to feel more threatened as we become more integrated and as speech becomes more pervasive. The second thing that's happening is that the American press in particular is contracting in its coverage of foreign affairs. The financial crisis that has beset every single branch and part of the American media, journalism, has resulted in a need to pull back in areas that are expensive, and foreign coverage of foreign issues is one of those things that's very expensive. And so the closing of foreign bureaus, the decline of foreign correspondence is a very serious matter. I've interviewed people, for example, about the number of foreign correspondents from the United States covering China. Let's say the number is between 20 and 30, I'm told. David will know more about that. The number of full-time, on-the-ground institutions covering Afghanistan is probably, at least it was until recently, just two major newspapers, the New York Times and the Washington Post. This is a very, very grave matter that the press that we have and have built up is in a position financially where it is needing to retreat from coverage of foreign issues. I know that there's a view that, in fact, the proliferation of possible voices on the internet in particular will make up for that and, in fact, increase the amount of information. Let me just say for the record right now, I just don't share that view. I think that it's very important. I'm glad that that's happening, but I think the notion of professional journalism is something different, and we need that. Now, when you begin to see the world in this way, I think things start to change in your mind. So take one very big change. I see this as a necessary and very important move from understanding things like freedom of the press as a matter of human rights, and rather should see it as a very practical need to set up a flow of information and ideas that we can use to decide what to do in the world. Human rights as a concept, very, very important, but it's based on a notion where we have our system here and we believe the rest of humanity should share in that. But in a global public forum idea, it's not just us having ours and let's have those people be able to have this as well. It's we need everything that they have and they need everything we have. It's very pragmatic. The other big point I would make after you change the conception of how to think about this is that we really need to understand the very rich and complex tradition of freedom of the press in the United States. Because as we engage with the world, as we really must on these issues, we have to understand where we're coming from and what we have built up. And as I said, it's very, very complicated and important not to simplify and oversimplify. There are many facts about it that people just don't realize. What we think of today as freedom of the press is very recent. The first Supreme Court case interpreting the First Amendment was in 1919. There's no Supreme Court case from the point at which the Bill of Rights are adopted until 1919. And furthermore, it has a very, very inauspicious beginning. Indeed, one of the cases that is upheld, that is one of the convictions upheld by the Supreme Court in 1919, is a person who gave a speech in Ohio simply praising people who resisted the draft. That person, Oliver Wendell Holmes, writing for a unanimous Supreme Court, announced you can't yell fire in a crowded, falsely in a crowded theater. That person does not have free speech rights to praise people who violate the law. You go to jail. That person happened to be a candidate for President of the United States, Eugene Debs. And while in jail in 1920, received over 1 million votes for President of the United States. So when we think about our own tradition, and we are ready to criticize other countries for what they're doing on free speech and free press, it's important to remember that not every point in our history, even in the most recent past, have we lived up to our own ideals. So it's a long time that it takes to do this. It's not easy. We have, as I said, a very complicated system, which I'd be happy to talk about. We now need to project that, I believe, onto the world stage. I happen to believe that what we've arrived at is right and sound and good, and it has good reasons behind it. And I think it should apply to many other parts of the world and to a global community. But that's a rich, deep debate that has to happen. The First Amendment community, of which I come from, in large part has not entered that debate yet. And one of the things I'm trying to call for is for that very talented community to engage with these issues. And in a sense, it is a recapitulation of what happened in this country. So I begin by saying the global public forum is, we now need discussion on a global scale to discuss global issues, and censorship anywhere can be censorship everywhere. That's precisely what happened in the famous case of the First Amendment in 1964 in New York Times versus Sullivan. Alabama enters a libel judgment against the New York Times just for a few copies that are sold there. And the Supreme Court clearly realized we now have global or national issues to talk about, and a state law about libel can have a chilling impact on a national discussion. And hence, the great doctrine of New York Times versus Sullivan was established. That recapitulation now has to occur on a global scale. I'd Lastly, I would just say there are a number of things that I believe should happen, I recommend. One is we really need to rethink public funding of the press. I believe journalism is a public good as well as something that is part of the marketplace, and we need to think about supporting it through greater public funding. That's highly controversial. Journalists react very negatively to that for the most part, except people in NPR and PBS. We can talk about that. But I also think that we need to change the public funding system we have. We have an NPR and a PBS, very high quality journalism, for this country, which then uses some, works on foreign issues, largely, I must say, or significantly through importing BBC. And then we have Voice of America and Radio Free Europe and Al Hurra and Radio Marti as the government's propaganda publicly funded system for abroad. That may have been good for the Cold War, but it's not good for a global public forum. And we should launch what I call an American World Service, probably taking NPR and PBS and saying, go speak to the world and bring back the world to us. I also think we need to reshape the First Amendment. We look hypocritical to the world on free press when we do not allow our journalists to be present in war zones or arrest journalists because we want to inhibit them from covering things. And lastly, I think we need to build global legal institutions and norms to be places where we debate these things and where we resolve them. There are a number of them that are very important and successful. The Organization of American States, the UN, Human Rights Commission, obviously Europe, Africa has this. We need to build on that. Michael is an expert on this, but I think that is the key agenda, because at the end of the day, these should be great legal norms that are applied through legal institutions. So that's the thesis, and I thank you for letting me say it.
Thank you, Lee. It's a wonderful summary of the book. You should still read the book, but you've heard many of the key elements of it right there. I'm now very pleased to turn to Salman Rushdie.
Yeah, I'd like to congratulate Lee on his book. I mean, it was really, I think, a wonderful contribution to where we are on this thing now. And I mean, I've been thinking more and more about this question of global connectedness, because it's not just in the legal framework, but in every way you look in the world, everything joins up with everything else. You know, we don't any longer live in tidy little boxes. You know, all our boxes open up into other people's boxes, and there is this, you know, kind of butterfly effect when something happens in one country, the wings of the butterfly beat, and you hear the effect all over the world. I have to say that I'm, in general, a little bit pessimistic about the condition of free speech in the world today. And it seems to me, and that means everywhere in the world, and it seems to me that we may be losing the battle on this issue, and that many people no longer see it as a given, you know, that freedom of speech is good. And I just want to use these minutes to talk about the particular impact of ideological factors on this, and in particular, though not only, in particular religious factors. I mean, clearly, you mentioned, Lee, the case of China. In the case of China, the restrictions have nothing to do with religion. They have to do with other kinds of ideology. But one of the things that's developed in religious rhetoric in the last quarter century, let's say, is the development of a number of ideas for which there appears to be quite broad support in the global community, all of which enormously inhibit freedom of speech. One is a redescription of the meaning of the term respect. You know, when I was taught about respect in an intellectual context, It meant that you took people's ideas seriously, and if you didn't agree with them, you argued seriously against them. But that but respect did not contain the concept that you should not argue against people's ideas, because to do so was disrespectful of those ideas. We now live in a world in which respect is used in this other meaning, that if you dissent from ideas, if you express that dissent, whether politely or impolitely, you are thought to be disrespecting those ideas, and that becomes a powerful rhetoric against speaking in that way. Related to this is the idea that there is a right not to be offended, and that if a work or statement offends you, that is a reason for moving against it and for asking that such statements or works not be made. Now, clearly, it's my view that we do not have a right not to be offended, because if we did, then there would be no films in the theaters and no books in the bookshops, because many things offend many people. And if offense becomes the limiting point on thought, then it becomes impossible to speak. And yet that is, again, an idea which for many people has a kind of plausibility, because it relates to a sense of good manners or politeness, that you shouldn't be rude to people. So again, this specialized meaning of offense seems to chime with people's general sense of how one should behave in the world. And these two things get tied together by an increasingly narrow idea of identity, where identity is not as we understand it, as for instance Amartya Sen understands it, as something which is very wide-ranging and multiple and plural, but identity is identified as something very narrow. It becomes tribal or clannish or ideological or theological, and any offense against or anything which breaks the rules of that clan or tribe or faith becomes something that needs to be moved against. And I think that's the problem with these ideas, is they have quite wide currency, and not just amongst conservatives, not just amongst religious extremists, but amongst the public at large. And they are used in many different societies, including this one, to inhibit freedom. I just wanted to mention a few examples and instances of this in different parts of the world. In England, a couple of years ago, just at the end of Tony Blair's prime ministership, he attempted to introduce, more than once actually, attempted to introduce a law making it illegal, essentially making it illegal to criticize religion. The law was called, or the bill was called, a bill against the incitement of religious hatred. And it was very much, there exists in England a law against the incitement of racial hatred. And that's one of the ways in which English law differs from American law. In American law, the First Amendment would in fact protect the expression of what in England would be seen as hate speech. Right. And so the argument was that since there's already a law against racial hatred, this should be extended to cover religion. This was essentially, to put it bluntly, an attempt by the Blair government to regain support among the Muslim community, which they had lost because of the Iraq War. And it had the effect of, had it come to become law, it would have had an extraordinarily chilling effect on what could be said and couldn't be said. In the end, the law failed in the most spectacular way. On the day that it was being voted on in the House of Commons, the Labour chief whips miscounted and told Mr. Blair that the bill was lost, and as a result, he went home to dinner, and the bill failed by one vote. So the Prime Minister, by failing to vote, lost his own bill. Because had he voted, it would have been a tied vote, whereupon the Speaker of the House of Commons would cast the casting vote in favor of the government, and the bill would have become law. So makes you believe there's a God. No, there isn't. There was a moment, I just wanted to share, the comic moment, when, amongst other people, I went to lobby the British Home Office against this bill, along with the comedian Rowan Atkinson, Mr. Bean, Mr. Bean goes to Parliament. and there was just an unforgettable moment when Rowan, he's in real life, he's a very shy, quietly spoken man, but thinks very deeply. And of course, he was in this meeting with government, with ministers and civil servants, who were all his fans. So they all wanted him to like them, and were therefore upset that he didn't. And he said, let me give you an example, he said. He said, recently, on my television program, we showed a clip of film of prayers from, I believe it was Iran. And over this sequence of Friday prayers, I said in voiceover, and the search goes on for the Ayatollah's contact lens. And he said, well, so would I be allowed to say that, or would I in fact go to jail? And the government, of course, panicked and said, no, comedy, they were really in favor of it, and there was no question that anything like this would be prohibited, and, it was great. And he said, but how would I know that? How would I know that that would be so? And they said, oh, well, it's very simple. You just submit it to a government department and they'd rule. And he said, I'm sorry, but that oddly doesn't make me feel reassured. Anyway, so that failed by one vote, but that's how close it came in England to there being a law today which would make it impossible to criticize religion. I don't know, some of you may know, I had a little free speech issue myself at one point. Not to rehearse the whole of it, but there's one story that I wanted to tell you which I thought certainly clarified my views on this issue. Not long after the attack on the Stunning Verses, there was a film made in Pakistan called International Guerrillas, in which the heroes were the guerrillas of the title, who were basically international Islamic radicals, and the villain, I'm sorry to say, was me. And the task was to assassinate me, and that was to be the happy ending. And during the course of the film, there were a number of dreadful misrepresentations. For instance, I was seen throughout the film wearing a number of hideous safari suits, kind of eggplant-colored safari suits, vermilion-colored. So the fashion insult was really very profound. And I was also depicted as living in what looked very like a palace in the Philippines. All novelists have these second homes. And being protected by what looked very like Mossad. This is also a service that the Israeli Secret Service offers to literature. And I was, in my left hand, I had a bottle of whiskey. In my right hand, I usually had either a whip or cutlass, with which I would idly torment people, because that's the kind of guy I am. And at the end of the film, I was actually killed, but not by the international guerrillas, but in fact by the direct intervention of the Almighty. A Quran circling in the sky unleashes a thunderbolt which fries the Salman Rushdie character, and there's dignity in that. Anyway, this film, which is a very unpleasant piece of work, came to England and it applied for a certificate. And the British Board of Film Classification, seeing that the film was 19 different ways defamatory, and understanding that the law stated that if they were to license it, that they too could be liable for a legal action by me as being party to the defamation, they turned it down, refused the film a certificate. So then I find myself in the position of fighting a free speech battle and being defended by an act of censorship. Difficult decision to make. In the end, I wrote to the board formally to give up my right of legal recourse. I said, if this is on my account, here is a formal statement by me that I will not take legal action against the Board of Film Classification or against the filmmakers, and you should not ban the film on my account. So by one of the curious paradoxes of life, I got the film released in England. And it was the producers happily booked a big movie theater in Bradford in Yorkshire, which is the town with the largest Muslim population in Britain, and nobody went. Now, why did nobody go? Because it was a crappy film. right? And whatever people thought about me, they didn't want to spend their $10 on a crappy film. Now, what would have happened if the film had been banned? It would immediately have become the hottest video in the country. And its power would enormously have been increased, and its numbers of copies in print would have multiplied, and people would have gleefully watched it with drawn curtains, doing something taboo and contraband, and it would have been powerful. In the light of day, it was powerless. You know? So it taught me a profound lesson about how you can actually trust the public to be sensible. You know, because, in fact, people know the difference between good stuff and bad stuff, and they will not in the end spend their money on the bad stuff. And this relates to Lee's points in the book about Milton's faith that the truth will overcome error. And I mean, John Stuart Mill's different but kind of related idea that anyway you have to allow many different versions to exist because we can't be sure of what the truth is. Those classic formulations of freedom were very much borne out by this little episode. You know? And then recently I was in India, and India is going through a moment where censorship has become almost the norm. The most dramatic example of this recently has been the persecution of the grand old man of Indian art, Maqbool Fida Hussain, now in his mid-90s, somebody who for the last 60 years and more has been a major figure in Indian art, and who has literally been driven into exile by threats against his life and against his safety, and also a series of mischievous legal actions, and has now been obliged to take citizenship in Qatar as a way of passing his last years. With enormous hostility towards him in India. The reason for this is that he painted a sequence of pictures of Hindu goddesses unclothed. And this was believed to be pornographic and obscene and so on. And various questions that would have been obvious were not asked, such as, could you please show me the paintings of Hindu goddesses with clothes on? Hindu goddesses, the wardrobe of Hindu goddesses could be contained in my pocket. You know, actually, they wear a good deal of jewelry, but relatively few garments. And clearly, the unstated subtext of this was that this was a Muslim artist painting Hindu goddesses, and that was the nature of the insult. Anyway, he's been driven out of the country, and there's relatively little uproar about it, except from members of the artistic community. The government's really not doing much about it. And one of the conclusions I came to, and I just want to end with that, is that it's important not only to fight for the American idea of free speech. I mean, I do think of the First Amendment as being possibly the most valuable gift this country has given the world, you know, and is one of the reasons why people like me want to come and be here. You know, so I value it enormously. But one of the difficulties of presenting First Amendment values to the rest of the world as American exports is that that becomes a reason for objecting to them. And it seemed to me that it was entirely possible to construct an argument from inside the Indian tradition, which made the same case. And to give just one story, there is a story in one of the most ancient texts in the Hindu tradition, the Natya Shastra. The Natya Shastra is a text which basically is about performance. It's about theater and dance and so on. And it begins with this wonderful moment where the gods, having completed creation, decide that they're quite bored. Creation appears to be boring, they decide. And Brahma agrees that creation is boring, and he says the reason it's boring is that there's no entertainment. So we should have entertainment. And he then commissions the writing of the Natya Shastra to lay down the principles of entertainment, of theater and dance, and so on. And then the first play is held. The first play is held to the audience of the gods, and the subject of the play is the battle between the god Indra and the evil spirits, the Asuras. There's a good and evil battle in which Indra, of course, wins. And the gods are watching this with appreciation, and then the Asuras show up and object. They say this is an insult to their culture, it's an offense to them personally, this is unfair speech, and it should be prevented. And they, in a rather modern way, place a spell upon the actors, preventing them from continuing with the play. Well, the gods are so furious, Indra destroys the Asharas, and Brahma then states that the theater space will be protected by the gods. The gods will sit at the four corners of the stage and will protect the space, and the play must go on. You know, so you have there, at the very birth of the Hindu tradition, a passionate statement about the freedom of the arts. You know, and you could look at that, and there are other cases you could look at, which allow you to construct from that tradition an argument which chimes very closely with the American idea. And it seems to me, in the global world that you're talking about, we need to do that. You know, we can't just say, we have this good idea that you should buy. You know, we have to find the way in which that good idea combines with similar good ideas elsewhere. I like that. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Those are wonderful parables of free speech. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I want to start by talking about the title of Lee's book, Uninhibited, Robust, and Wide Open. That makes the business that I'm in, the business of gathering the news, sound really cool and almost sexy. And so I just want to say thank you for that, Lee. If we were to write a title, journalists in my business, for an account of our profession, it would be something like Nervous, Broke, and Hunkered Down. Or I was thinking of some of the themes in Lee's book. It might be necessary, needy, ready to be subsidized. Then I got to thinking about my friend Tom Friedman's latest book, and I thought maybe we should call it Cold, Cavernous, and Increasingly Lonely. So we love the title. The title emboldens us. I want to focus on one issue that this book discusses, which is the issue of embedding, and try to argue in a broad way against embedding. If you don't know this term, I should say first it has nothing to do with beds, at least not literally. It's the term that's used for the way in which reporters agree to travel with the U.S. military to cover wars. It's become pervasive in ways that I'm going to describe, but to me, increasingly, I feel as if we are living in more and more a world of embedded information. That is to say, the people who provide information are traveling with one side or another in a conflict, be it political, cultural, or the ultimate military conflict. This world of embedded media complicates the challenge that Lee poses for us. The idea that we can have a kind of global First Amendment. It makes the openness that he proposes much more complicated. A world of access that's controlled, where you embed with different armies, different groups, may look open. It certainly provides a lot of information, but it has some obvious problems. Like so many bad ideas, but I should say, as I'll make clear in a minute, not everything about embedding is bad, but like many bad ideas, this began with wonderful intentions. After the first Gulf War in 1991, journalists were frustrated that they had not been able, in many cases, to travel with the U.S. military into Kuwait and Iraq. Many of them had been left behind in the rear zones, as it were, in Dhahran and Riyadh, and they were unhappy. And so the delegations began going to the Pentagon demanding that there be new rules that would allow greater access, greater ability for reporters to move with the military. The Pentagon very sensibly understood early in this debate that the idea of having reporters have this exhilarating but very limited experience of racing to Baghdad in a Humvee and stopping every 12 or 24 hours to tell the world what it felt like was very much in their interest. And so as we moved toward the second Gulf War, the invasion of Iraq in March 2003, the Pentagon was making elaborate plans for members of the news media to embed with different units. I've written elsewhere that I think one reason for the really clearly inadequate examination of whether the invasion of Iraq made sense for the United States was that we in the news media knew that President Bush had already decided to invade. I mean, that decision was made really in the fall and early winter. And so we were getting ready to cover that war. Our first outpost in Kuwait to get ready to cover the war was set up in late December. And so in the months in which we might have been asking, does this make sense? What about this? What about this? We were getting ready to embed and to provide powerful coverage, which is obviously part of our job, of the war that we knew was coming. I had a different experience than many of my colleagues in that I covered the war, but I was not embedded. I was a so-called unilateral journalist. I was able to get into Iraq, initially sneaking across the Kuwait border with other colleagues in rented SUVs. And I learned two things from that experience, which are relevant, I think, for the issues that Lee poses. First, it is just too dangerous to cover modern maneuver warfare with a kind of firepower that's used typically if you're not traveling with an army. You can be on the ground, you can sort of protect yourself and then write about it. But if you're going to cover the rush of an army, it's very difficult to do that alone. And in truth, I found it impossible to stay in this unprotected state for very long in these early days. The second thing that I discovered, and this is the part that's really relevant, is that if you can escape the bubble, if you can see a war or anything from a broader vantage than through the turret of an armored personnel carrier, you see things that really make a difference. In my case, I would come into towns in southern Iraq after the U.S. Army had blown through on its way to Baghdad, and I would find people who were completely intimidated by the beginnings of what became the insurgency. In other words, in the first few weeks of the war, it was clear if you were traveling that there was this insurgency. It took, as you know, our government many, many months to admit that. As we know, as the war progressed through 2003, 2004, it became almost impossible as this insurgency grew powerful and adopted kidnapping as a primary weapon to move easily around Iraq. So embedding, traveling with U.S. military units became increasingly popular. It was a way to get out of central Baghdad and see some of the country, see some of the war. Arabic-speaking journalists for Iraqi news organizations and also for some international news organizations, in effect embedded with the insurgents. If you want a reminder of how dangerous that was, just click on the WikiLeaks video of the helicopter gunship sighting what turned out to be a Reuters cameraman with his camera slung over his arm in a way that looked to the helicopter crew like an RPG. That piece of video, I can't think of anything that's come out of the war, with the possible exception of the Abu Ghraib photographs, that's more disturbing than that. But that shows the price and the difficulty of being unembedded, or at least outside the U.S. military. If you want to imagine what the world that I'd like to see looks like, I would cite Beirut of the early 1980s. Now that may sound like a crazy proposition, but the funny thing about Beirut, this is where I started as a foreign correspondent, was that it was possible, although the Civil War was going on, there was shelling almost every day in periods, there was a green line that divided the city that had snipers on both sides, basically 24/7. But if you wanted to cover the war, you could spend the morning interviewing the PLO in West Beirut, get some crazy driver to drive you across the green line, interview the Maronite Christian militia, known as the Phalange, in the afternoon. If you felt really ambitious, you could go see the Druze militia and the Shuf, and maybe you'd go to the south and find the Shiite militia Amal. They all issued press credentials. They all wanted their story told. They all facilitated access. In other words, they had a stake in openness because they wanted information out. I think a part of the real world that I experience, Lee, that confounds the vision that you express in this wonderful book is that so many of the people on the other side now who used to want journalists to come see them now could care less. They basically perceive us as part of the enemy, and as I'm trying to suggest here, the prevalence of embedding, I fear, gives credence to that. But they don't need us. They can post their videos and their statements and whatever they want to the internet. We have been disintermediated. We are really irrelevant to their requirements. So let me move from the world of war correspondence briefly to the larger world of information. I fear that one consequence of the process that's causing so much trouble for my news organization, the rise of what I would say are more ideologically focused sources of information, is that the providers of information are themselves becoming embedded, and the readers and viewers of that information are sharing in it. Indeed, people seem sometimes to want that. People at the Washington Post and the New York Times were trained to provoke, challenge. That was what we saw as our job. I often fear that people who come to the websites that provide communities, and they're on the right and on the left. I could name them all, but you know what they are congenial for people precisely because they tell you that what you believe is right, and that the people who believe other things on the other side are wrong, and that makes the information they provide, the discussion they provide, feel like a club. It's that wonderful, cozy feeling of social networking. But it couldn't be more different than the information world that I grew up in. So, we all know, watching cable, how pervasive this can become. I always feel that when I'm watching Fox News, and increasingly, I have to be honest, when I'm watching MSNBC, it's as if the people on the screen know who they're rooting for. It's kind of there's a home team and then there's an away team, and there's a subtle but real spin that bothers me. So let me just conclude by expressing concern about this phenomenon of embedded information. Express concern about our need in the part of the media that I live in to rebuild trust. One of the odd things to me is that people deride the so-called mainstream media, newspapers like the Washington Post, for having what they see as an agenda. There's no question that we have unexamined biases. We could talk about at length. I mean, if you there's a way in which we converge toward the center of arguments, and we forget that centrism, bipartisanship, is an ideology all its own, and one that tends to exclude things that are at the wings. So, but we need to think of how we make what we do seem cool and sexy. That's why I love Lee's title so much. We need, I think, to be very wary of some of the sources of funding that are proposed to us in this hour of crisis. And as Lee knows, this is an area where I do disagree with him. I think that for media that both at home and abroad is perceived already too much as embedded with the government, as having in effect taken sides. I would have trouble, Lee, speaking with my colleagues at Dawn in Pakistan, or at Sharq al-Awsat, an Arabic newspaper, or at Yediot Ahronot in Israel, if we were really on the dole and giving them my spiel about independence and professionalism. So let me just close by saying that the world that Lee proposes is the one that I dream of living and working in which there is global access to information, a sort of global First Amendment. My own feeling is that the path to getting there has more to do with what we do privately, with our ability in the news business to establish professional bonds with our colleagues at Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, Dawn, all the other places that I could name. Hold them to account, hold them to standards that we have, and let them hold us to standards, so that we are interdependent in this world. You know, I'm going to take Lee's book with me the next time I go see my friends who help run Al Jazeera in Doha, and you know, maybe we'll have a symposium there, Lee, to talk about how to get to the promised land.
Thank you, David. Those are two really grim diagnoses: double embedding, military embedding, and then ideological embedding, and that poses a huge challenge to those of us who want to discover a global public information space that is viable and one that sustains democratic governance. Thank you. Michael?
We've been mostly talking about macro limitations on free expression. I've been thinking also about some micro limitations as well. Unlike Salman and David, I'm the discussant here, obliged to comment on the work of my own boss. It's a little bit delicate. If I offer...
Depends on what you say.
Right. But even if I offer praise, if it's too much praise, I'm currying favor. Yeah, exactly. If it's too much criticism, I could be in trouble. But in my brief time at Columbia, I seem to have learned to say things that offend. But the most offensive thing I have said publicly turns out to be something that Lee says also in this book. In a report published in the fall and sponsored by the journalism school here, my co-author, Leonard Downey, former executive editor of the Washington Post, and I proposed, to David's chagrin perhaps, that the U.S. government should provide more financial assistance for news reporting than it does today. We were subsequently lectured by a variety of critics. We were told, as if we were school children, that government financing means government control, and if our recommendations were ever to be put in practice, we could kiss a free press goodbye. On this point, Len Downey, Lee Bollinger, and I are all heretics in the House of Journalism. Our report praised the significant achievements of American journalism, but we wrote the report because the country's daily newspapers have, in just a few years, lost about a third of their reporters, editors, and photographers. We have on our hands a considerable crisis in the production of original reporting. This at the very moment that the internet has made possible a flowering of commentary, criticism, annotation, and debate. This week, with the Pulitzer Prizes just announced, we are reminded of continued brave and brilliant work in our news media. But at the same time, the number of reporters who are paid to cover state legislatures, city halls, and school boards continues to dwindle. Our report looked inward, and we worried most of all about the decline in state and local reporting. Lee's book, I guess we could nickname it Uninhibited, looks outward and asks that we reconceive the American news media in a global context. He does this, and here's the point where I will verge on unseemly flattery, he does this in a highly original way, pushing beyond other thinkers and pressing an agenda for change, or as he puts it, projecting outward the principle of freedom of the press onto the world stage and making it a primary goal as we build the rudiments of a global society. Among his suggestions, just to mention one to indicate how far-reaching is his argument, he asks that we think about adding a kind of free press clause in international trade negotiations, just as some have advocated a social clause imposing labor rights and environmental protection on our trading partners. Now we would make enforcement of legal protections for a free press a requirement for countries that trade with us. I don't know if Lee actually thinks that's feasible, but what he's asking is that we challenge a complacency in our thinking and that we come to recognize that freedom of the press for others around the world is, in the global society we have entered, increasingly essential to our own freedom and the quality of our own news and news gathering. But here I would suggest a somewhat different approach. And in this, I am influenced by the critical response our report received this fall. Consider a statement a few months ago by Harold Furtgott Roth, a former FCC commissioner. He wrote, "Direct government support of journalism is a foreign concept. The Soviet Union had Pravda and Izvestia, news outlets that supposedly competed with one another to add insult to the injury of the absence of a free press. Every repressive regime in the world today controls some part of its national media and censors the rest. From government subsidy of journalism, the commissioner moved straight to Pravda. Do not pass go, do not collect $200, go directly to jail. But the question, it seems to me, is not what repressive regimes do with government subsidies, but with what democracies do with government subsidies. I don't have to tell Lee this. His book pays attention to the BBC, for example, and the world-class success of public funding through the television license fee in the UK of this extraordinary institution with an annual budget of $6 billion and an international influence second to none. What's the lesson here? For Lee Bollinger, part of the lesson is that you can have government subsidy and not lose freedom of the press. But also for him, it is that the U.S. should compete more boldly for global media influence, that it should, as he puts it, enlarge its global footprint. I see a different lesson. The question should be not how can we compete with the BBC or Al Jazeera or China's Central Television, but what can we learn from ways of doing journalism in other democracies around the world? The American assumption, particularly for American journalists, is that government funding will quickly destroy freedom of the press. I think that is quite simply a provincial American fantasy. Why that fantasy endures, especially among journalists, is a good question. Government funding does open the door to government control. But by that same logic, commercial funding leads to, or can lead to, corporate control or advertiser control. And philanthropic funding can leave its recipients vulnerable to fashions in the foundation world and the whims of individual philanthropists. But to assert that any government funding for the media is the beginning of the end of press freedom requires ignoring a few very large facts: that NPR and PBS have operated for 40 years without having yet turned us into a slave state, that subsidies to newspapers began in this country through the post office in 1792 and helped the American newspaper industry establish itself in the first place, that the BBC exists, that among other democracies, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Austria, France, directly subsidized their newspapers. The strong legal framework of press freedom in the American system does not and should not suggest that we have more free expression in America than elsewhere. In fact, some people would argue quite otherwise. If you look at the Freedom House rankings of global press freedom, Finland and Iceland come out on top, not the United States. And they're followed by Belgium, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Luxembourg, Switzerland, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Portugal, and Jamaica before you get to us. We're tied with Estonia, Germany, and Ireland. The French-based Reporters Without Borders has Finland tied for first place with Denmark, Ireland, Norway, and Sweden. The US is tied with the UK and Luxembourg in 20th place. How do they do these rankings? Well, they weigh legal, political, and economic constraints on press liberty. That's a start. It's not sufficient. Measuring formal limits on free speech and free press does not map the extent to which the afforded freedoms are actually used. For instance, it may well be that Sweden has fewer formal constraints on a free press than the US. Sweden, in fact, was the only country before the United States to have a Freedom of Information Act. But what do Swedish journalists do with that freedom? I pick on Sweden because there's a good historical study of changes in their television news coverage. Swedish journalism has become more aggressive and more critical over time, but it learned to let go of a highly deferential culture, deferential to politicians and government officials, only in the 1960s and 1970s, learning from British examples and to some extent American examples as well. US journalism has a significant tradition of investigative reporting that is a real hallmark of our way of doing the news, much more so, students of the European press seem to agree, than in most or all of the democracies of Europe. At the same time, the US, by any comparative measure, invests a paltry sum in public broadcasting. And where there is stronger public broadcasting of the news, some things seem to follow. A recent study of what citizens know of public affairs in Finland, Denmark, and Britain, all of them with strong public broadcasting, and the US, found Americans trailing in knowledge of world affairs in every respect, trailing badly, actually. At the top of the heap was Finland, apparently not only the least constrained press in the world, but the best informed citizenry. So if we wanted to do the best possible good for expanding uninhibited, robust, and wide open communication, maybe we should extend the Finnish model as far as we can, not the American. And in the American model, what we should export may be the investigative vigor of the newsroom, perhaps even more rare and more valuable than the First Amendment. There is, I think, and here's where I'm going on the more critical side here, a kind of implied chauvinism in Lee's argument that he tries to soften by insisting that we should try to spread American traditions and values about the free press, not because we are missionaries spreading the American gospel, but because as part of a global society, we are more and more dependent on other nations for information that affects our own well-being. Self-interest, not moral arrogance, should lead us to promote our ways abroad. But I don't know that that will work better. I don't know that other parts of the world will appreciate our views more because we say, well, we're only doing it because it's in our own self-interest, rather than we're advising you to do this because we're morally superior. I agree with Lee that our First Amendment tradition offers a moral beacon to others as well as to ourselves. But I don't think we'll get anywhere through the stick of punishment in international trade negotiations. I think he's on firmer ground when he advocates the carrots of learning and education. We train foreign journalists here. We can do more of it, and we can do it better. This happens not only in journalism schools, but sometimes through news organizations themselves. The Washington Post, I learned, has had for decades now the Lawrence Stern Fellowship, in which one British journalist every year comes over and spends the summer doing an internship at the Post, imbibing the air of the Washington Post newsroom. And there is the global impact of U.S. journalistic achievements themselves. The Washington Post's role in uncovering Watergate sent ripples around the world, spreading inspiration and even language. It was followed in South Africa by a Muldergate and an Inkatha-gate, a German Watergate, a Polish Watergate. In Argentina, a Sidegate, a Yoma-gate, a Narco-gate, a Swift-gate. Brazil, Kohler-gate. Colombia's Samper-gate, and what in Canada was called simply Watergate envy. I have to come to a close, but I can't help but mention one important point that, as a professor at a journalism school, stood out for me in Lee's book in neon. Please don't miss page 87, where Lee compares journalism to other institutions, including universities, and he writes, "By training, experience, and professional disposition, the press is more agile, quicker to see the story, and better able to explain it to the public than many other institutions. In the new frontier of globalization, the press must be our scout and our explorer." We are so used to criticizing, in institutions like this one, inadequate academic work as journalistic, that the absence of that criticism here in the work of a leading university president is remarkable. And I think the features that Lee points to are well chosen. Journalism has shown, not always, but at its best, more than academia, agility, a perception of the story, and an orientation to public explanation. Clearly, Lee Bollinger is no slouch at public explanation himself, as he has demonstrated again, and we should all be grateful for that.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you, Michael. We have about 15 minutes. What I'd like to do is just to identify an area of difference here on the panel, mention one other issue that was raised to me a couple nights ago by a colleague here at Columbia, and then open up to questions, and then the panelists will have a chance to respond to whichever part of it they would like in the minutes we have. The area of difference we have is clearly public funding. We have some differences here on the panel in that question that I think are worth pursuing because it is one of the major recommendations in Lee's book. The issue that was raised to me by a colleague, I won't mention his name because I don't think he could be here this evening. He wrote an article on corruption in Indonesia and in Singapore for a very eminent newspaper, one of the top 3 newspapers in my view of the US. It was printed in the print edition here in the US, but it was not put up on their web edition because they were concerned that they would face a lawsuit in Indonesia or in Singapore. And so the question that it stimulates is, are we moving into a world sort of like the situation that the Texas School Board used to pose for textbooks as sort of a locally censoring, nationally significant system where some of the countries of this world, by the very power of the market and the need to have the press be financially viable, can exercise a censoring influence, a race to the bottom, if you will, is a question that I'd welcome any reactions to on the panel. But before one goes to question 1 or question 2, I'd like to open it to a question or a comment from the panel. You'll need to wave your hand vigorously because of the lights that are shining in my eyes. And second of all, then identify yourself when I call upon you. The hand that I see over there.
Hi, thank you for the inspiring talk, all four of you. My name is David de Jong. I'm a student at the history department. My question is for Mr. Rushdie. I don't know if you have followed the case which is now going on in the Netherlands with the politician Geert Wilders, who is being prosecuted. He's a member of parliament and he's being prosecuted for things he said against the Islam. He said he compared the Quran to Mein Kampf, and he said all these things. And he's now, as a member of parliament, being prosecuted for slander and defamation of the Islam. And it's come to a lawsuit, and he's going to be in court. And I would just wonder, and the opinions in Holland are very divided about it. Some think it's a good thing that he's being prosecuted, and others completely disagree with it. And I was wondering, how do you view this?
Is this, you're talking about Geert Wilders?
Yes,
or?
I am, yeah.
Okay, thank you for that question. I would take one more, then I'll turn to our panelists. In the far back over there is a hand waving.
Hi, thank you all for coming. My name is Hadi El Zain. I'm a first year in the college. And I was just wondering, this question is basically for any of the panelists that would be interested in answering. But I think it's easy to forget when we're in a university like this that there are a lot of people in this country that are very apathetic and even ignorant about the rest of the world. And when you look at media like CNN or Fox, what you see is a preponderance of like commentators more than news, or cycling the same stories, and just far fewer stories about the rest of the world than if you looked at, say, BBC. And I was wondering if this is more of a, do you think that this is a symptom of just the fact that the United States is surrounded by two bodies of water, or is there some sort of default in the education, or why is it that so much of the media that we have is so United States focused and does not really talk as much about the rest of the world, and what can we do to fix that? Thank you.
Great, thank you for that question. So there are four questions out there, and any of the panelists should feel free to glom onto any one of them. One specifically has been addressed to you, Salman, so maybe we should start with that.
Well, let me just quickly, because I think that can be answered briefly. I mean, I think one of the frequent facts about the free speech argument is that you find yourself defending people you don't like. Because essentially, it's easy to defend the free speech of people that you agree with, or that you don't disagree with very strongly, or to whose opinions you're more or less indifferent. And so it seems to me that the defense of free speech always begins when people say things you can't stand. When people say things that get up your nose, that's when you discover whether you're a free speech advocate or not. And so, I mean, I have no very strong view about Geert Wilders. I mean, he seems to veer towards the self-publicist a lot, and he says all kinds of things which seem to be said for dramatic effect. But to say that he should not say those things and be prosecuted for saying them is to fall away from the standards that Lee's book tries to espouse. And so, of course, I would defend his right to say those things.
Thank you. Any of the other issues anyone would like to address?
Well, I will just try to say something quickly about two things. First of all, I love Salman's idea of trying to find and root freedom of speech and press in the traditions of every part of the world. And I think Michael's point about the sort of chauvinistic problem, I think is a very serious one. I'm trying to engage primarily the First Amendment community, as I said at the beginning, in this debate. And I think to say, we've worked on this, we believe it, let's go debate this on a world stage. And of course you have to listen, and to try to develop the themes out of many cultures would be wonderful, as well as being prepared to change your mind, because I think that's all part of what free speech means. The issue of public funding is just one of many things to when you think about this global public forum and how are we going to get more information and how are we going to deal with the conflict of censorship and how are we going to get quality, public funding is simply one component to think about. I would say the following. It's very important to realize that the journalism that we have in the United States at this moment and have had for the last couple of decades is not the product of a free market. There are a lot of people who would like to see our flourishing press as the product of a century or more of private enterprise in the form of the press. There are three components of the press in America. There's the print media, newspapers, magazines, so on, broadcasting, and publicly funded PBS and NPR. Obviously, the last one has significant public funding, dating back to the 1960s. Broadcasting is a deliberate choice on the part of the society from 1927, 1934, upheld unanimously by the Supreme Court in 1969. That is a choice to have a hybrid system of private enterprise mixed with government regulation, including government regulation of content, to try to promote discussion, fairness doctrine, equal time provision, and so on. That system is not a pure private enterprise, private free market system. It could have been. All those airwaves could have been auctioned off to the highest bidder, and it could have functioned as an entirely free market. That choice was not made. We have a mixed system, and it was upheld by the Supreme Court. Newspapers are not the product of a free market as we understand them today. They are the product of private enterprise. It's true in a free market. It's true in a monopoly position. So over the course of the 20th century, one of the really stunning facts is that newspapers went from fair competition to, by the 1960s and 70s, one newspaper for every city, or one newspaper owner for every city in the country. Over 90% of American cities had one daily newspaper. Those monopoly profits were used to elevate the quality of journalism. A lot of that money was put into hiring science writers and law people who had legal degrees and economics, PhDs, and so on. It elevated because of the culture of journalism that was so strong. It was a great thing. The point is, we do not have today a press that is the result of a free market. So insofar as, I'm not saying David's saying this, but insofar as a lot of people argue, let the internet play itself out, get rid of all public funding, we should have no public funding at all of the media. You have to realize we have never had that. And it doesn't exist, and it's I think, a very serious risk to venture out into that kind of press. There is no reason, I think, to think that a free market would provide the level and quality of information that a democracy needs to function really well. That's the nature of a public good, and so I think you have to fund it. The only other point I'd make is that it's very important to remember that hundreds of millions of dollars come to this university every year, just like all the top research universities, to fund science research. That is government funding. We care as much about academic freedom as the press cares about journalistic autonomy and protection. And a system has been devised that basically works pretty well. NPR, PBS, BBC, BBC World Service, these are examples of really high-quality journalism that works in a very successful mixed system, I would say, of free markets. And lastly, there are ways to develop constitutional principles, First Amendment principles, that would guarantee, from a constitutional standpoint, that if the government tried to use the leverage of funding, that would be a violation of the First Amendment, to regulate content, interfere in the editorial. So there are various things to think about here. I do not take lightly David's very compelling arguments very beautifully expressed, as always, about embedded information and the problem of government control and what could happen. I mean, these are very serious matters. I just wanted to make sure I got those points out.
Good, thank you. We could take one more question, I think. And I think again in the far back. Yes. I'm sorry, I can't see you at all. So please come to the microphone.
Mr. Rushdie, my name is Parenta Basu. I live in England, professor of economics, presently a visiting scholar here. So I'm a great admirer of your work, but I have one concern. My understanding of your talk is that you basically says that this right to to deserve some respect or not to feel offended, this could be deterrence to freedom of speech. Now the question is that where do you really draw a boundary, because religion, ethnicity, and race, they're inextricably connected. So if I make a comment about that could offend some religion, that could be deemed as a racist comment. I'll give you an example. One of my non-Indian friends once told me, I'm not a religious person, but said, you worship wrong things. You worship private parts of the body, Lord Shiva, right? Shiva Lingam. So that, I thought it was a racist comment, but I felt very amused. But the question, there's a racial law also, which prevents this kind of comments. If a professor makes a statement in a class or somewhere publicly, this could be deemed as an offense and the person can lose job. So I just wonder, where do you really draw the borderline? Thank you.
Thank you. We could do just one more, I see on the time, and I would go to this side again, right over there. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you all for the wonderful discussion. My name is Harita, and I'm a physics student. I have a question for Rushdie. I'd like to elaborate on what he asked. When you really, make an art form and aim it such that it provokes someone, or it offends someone, how do you decide whether it's freedom of speech or just plain being mean?
Okay, thank you very much for those questions. I'll let you start at that, Salman.
Well, let me just say very briefly that it seems to me that religion and ethnicity are not interchangeable concepts. You can't choose your race, you can choose your ideas. And so one is a question of choice, the other is a question of necessity, and so different rules apply. It seems to me I can argue with your religious beliefs without limitation. To criticize you because of the color of your skin or your race, that's something over which you have no control. It's a different matter. Philip Pullman, the British writer, author of the Golden Compass and many other books, has just published a book in England whose title is The Good Man Jesus and the Scoundrel Christ. There's, you might imagine, little discussion about this title, apart from anything else. Philip Pullman, I saw today, answering very similar questions to the ones that have been asked. And he answered them, I think, in a very forthright and trenchant way, which I would myself echo. He said, you don't have to like my book. You can dislike my book. Nobody is asking you to read it. Nobody is asking you to buy it. If you start reading it and you don't like it, you can stop reading it. If you want to tell other people not to read it, that is your right. If you want to publish articles saying that you don't like the book, you can do that. You can argue in a public place. You can write your own book. All of that is completely legitimate. What is not legitimate, he said, is to tell me that I can't write my book and that it must not be published and that people who want to read it must not read it. That's the nature of the argument. You don't have to write books that everybody likes. People can choose the books they read. That is why in bookshops we have books by more than one author expressing different opinions. Many of those are books that I don't like. I promised I promised myself I would make no Dan Brown jokes, so I will not. But I feel he should be allowed to live. Not necessarily to write, but anyway, the argument is very simple. When you close a book, it loses its ability to offend you. You don't have to read it, but you also cannot stand in the way of those who wish to do so.
Michael, could I just
Sure.
respond to the earlier question that I think we left out about why, from the student, about why American news is so U.S.-centered. I'm not sure I have much of an answer, but it is something I've thought about because it's quite striking whenever one travels elsewhere. But I do think the two oceans, your suggestion, has something to do with it. I do think the fact that the U.S. is a superpower, everyone needs to know something about the superpower, and the superpower doesn't think it needs to know very much about anybody else. You know, superpower is one way to call it, empire is another way to call it, but it's, you know, we are, for better and for worse, the top dog. And I mean, in a way, this is part of what Lee's book is addressed to. How do we reconceive ourselves as part of a global society?
Yes, please. Sure, David.
I wanted to speak to the question that's come up in different ways about whether Lee is being chauvinistic in proposing that our kind of journalism should be, in effect, should be universal, our rules. And I just want to speak very briefly about my experience as editor of the International Herald Tribune, where our job really was precisely that, to project our news values, the way that we cover news as American newspapers. At that time, the paper was owned by the New York Times and the Washington Post, to project that for an international audience. And I have to say that, with all due deference to Finnish journalists or the long list that Michael offered, it was generally my experience that in the countries where we distributed the International Herald Tribune, most of the leading newspapers were, to use the phrase I used earlier, embedded with a political party, a philosophy. I mean, I think that's true with most British newspapers. You know, they're fun to read. They have lots of interesting information, but they have a spin, which is recognizable. It's certainly true with French newspapers. I'll close with a story that taught me something about the extent to which our values really can be projected and become universal in this era. We had a little investigative scoop about the son of a very prominent Hong Kong Chinese businessman who was himself the head of a large company. And we found out that, contrary to his claims and all sorts of corporate statements, he had not in fact graduated from the American university that he said he'd graduated from. Not the biggest story in history, but it was a good kind of little gotcha. And so we were doing our final checking prior to running the story the next day with the company, and they essentially threatened to sue us in every location where we published the International Herald Tribune around the world. I mean, there was a flat-out attempt to intimidate us, and we're very vulnerable because we published so many different places. And I was thinking, what on earth should we do? And late at night, I got the idea that we should just put the story out on the internet, on the IHT's website. It's very hard to say where is that published, and what is the jurisdiction, and how would you sue? Well, the reason I tell this story is because within hours, all of the leading Hong Kong newspapers had taken this story, translated it into Chinese. It was bannered across. You couldn't move in Hong Kong without seeing this story in screaming headlines. By the afternoon of that day, this young man who had never told his father this truth had confessed it to his father, had gone on sort of Hong Kong television to say that it was true. He was deeply... So, in a sense, trusting that there's more of that press freedom instinct out there than you might think ended up working in that case.
Please join me in thanking all of our panelists for this provocative set of statements.